For those of you who don't know me, my name is Stefan Kalb. I'm an assistant teaching professor in the German department. And before I introduce our speaker tonight, I wanted to thank my colleagues here at the CSLC, Breen, Maggie, who's Wende, and also Toko for helping setting up Scott's visit and for generously also supporting his visit to Notre Dame. I'm very thankful for that you made that possible here. It's my great pleasure and honor to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Scott Windham, who is an associate professor of German in the Department of World Languages and Cultures at Elon University in North Carolina. At Elon, Scott also serves as the coordinator for the Interdisciplinary German Studies program. And this is a program where students from across campus, communications, history, business, come together with a variety of academic and disciplinary interests to study things German in multiple disciplinary ways. And so as you can see, he's very creative in outreach and getting students who might not have any interest in German to be interested in German studies. Scott holds a PhD in comparative literature from UNC Chapel Hill, and he published early on in his career on the German playwright Peter Weiss. More recently, however, his research has shifted to the scholarship of teaching and learning, and he has a special interest in grammar instruction, writing, student motivation, and also curriculum design. On a more personal note, when I was in graduate school at Duke University and UNC Chapel Hill, I participated in a program called Preparing Future Faculty, where we sort of shadowed a professor at a different institution to get a sense of what is it like to be a faculty. And Scott was my PFF mentor, and he introduced me to this idea that you can be a faculty and a faculty scholar in the field of teaching and learning and second language acquisition, and that's just as valuable of a career as being an R1 research professor somewhere. He really ignited this passion in me for language teaching and for evidence research-based language instruction and curriculum design. So I really credit him a lot for the kind of path that I've taken in my career, and it's a great pleasure to have him here tonight to speak about why we still need grammar instruction, but still need to do it better, grammar instruction and literacy in the L2 classroom. And we were just talking about this presentation earlier. He said he has given a version of this and it created a lot of anger in the audience. I guess anger is good because it means there is debate and people are discussing critically, so be prepared to make me be angry.
So if you brought your pitchforks, sharpen them. So thank you for having me, and I want to start with that idea of a genuine note of thanks. Notre Dame, in the part of the world where I live, is known for a lot of things. Academic excellence, scholarship, your mission of outreach and service, your success in that bizarre sport with the oblong ball. Where I'm from, we are more interested in the round ball. You guys. But to that list of things that you are well known for, I will add hospitality. I have felt welcomed since the moment I received the invitation and got off the plane. It's been very generous of you, and I want to particularly thank Stefan and the rest of the German department for organizing, and Breen and Maggie and the rest of the CSLC staff for making it possible. Okay, so I have, here's the outline. 5 points, the bulk of the presentation on that fifth. And I'll begin with a caveat. This is a SOTL project. I'm not in SLA. One of the things I like about SOTL is that it lets those of us who have training outside of SLA sort of do language stuff, right? Because we get to focus on what we were trained to do in graduate school, which is texts. And I like that overlap. The second part of that caveat is that I used to be department chair, and I'm also the co-coordinator of our SOTL group in my department, so my stance is a pragmatic one. So what kinds of things can we get done in a department of 30 people across 9 languages? So that pragmatism is where how I approach this project. So with those caveats in mind, I have 2 goals. One is for you. I hope that you'll come away with one new perspective on how and why to teach grammar, and to do so in a way that improves literate use of the language. Because, for me, one of the most difficult things about SOTL is not so much catching up on the scholarship, but then implementing what that scholarship suggests. My SOTL group, when we first started out, We read some of the seminal works by Heidi Burns, for example. And the problem that we faced was that reading or Richard Kern, reading these books, we didn't know how to actually do what they were talking about. So the books are written on a theoretical level. We actually made a road trip from Central North Carolina up to DC to watch the Georgetown faculty, the German faculty at Georgetown teach the way in which that they described in their research literature. So that's what I've been working on, is trying to, so to speak, translate the research into actual things you can do in the classroom. So that's the goal for what I hope you'll get out of it, is one way that you can do this stuff. And what I hope that I will do, or what I'll come away with, is maybe having removed some of the blinders that we all always have about our work. I would like you to challenge me and put me through my paces. This project is central to what I'm going to do over the next number of years. Maybe who knows how long it'll occupy me. So I kind of want to get it right. So I invite you to question my assumptions. All right. So right before I get to my main argument, let me set the curricular stage for you. This is kind of what we're doing in my department. All right, so we based our curricular development on the work of Heidi Burns and Hiram Maxim, among others, working towards a genre-based curriculum. And the way we do that is we have genres that contain mostly personal and familiar discourses at the beginning of the curriculum, the lower level courses, and genres that contain mostly public discourses at the upper division. And Hiram Maxim has published really good nuts and bolts how-to articles on that, and he gives really good talks at Actual. So there's that. As far as literacy goes, there are a million different definitions of literacy. And, Kern and Burns, two of the people who are best known for working in the field of literacy, they don't necessarily agree with one another. So to get literacy done, so to speak, we knew that we needed to frame literacy in terms of curricular goals. So that was one of our first big moves, was to do that. And we ended up having to tinker with those goals in order to make them align with how the university talks about teaching and how the university talks about learning. But in the end, what we have is 3 curricular goals that both meet or support Kern's description of literacy and also align with the university's stance towards learning. Okay. Oh, and by the way, I make these slides publicly available, so if you don't like taking notes, you can download the slides at the end. I'll give you a link. Okay, so now that I have explained the curricular context, let me get to why I chose the word still. So I don't claim to know the entire history of grammar instruction in L2 context in the United States. I do know that when I was in grad school in the 90s, the communicative method was king, and it inherently questioned the necessity of real grammatical understanding, right? So Hiram Maxim pointed out that the communicative method limits our focus on texts, which is, of course, what we want university graduates to be able to do when they're here, but then also once they leave, is work with texts, regardless of what they do after college. And Maxim also says that the communicative method keeps us from exploring the types of language that students need in order to accomplish particular academic goals or social goals or business goals or what have you. So, I think that from my perspective, the communicative method is valuable as pedagogy. Like, we can borrow strategies from it. But I don't see it as particularly useful for grounding a curriculum. So that's one reason why we still need grammar, is what Maxim has said about sort of countering the dominance of the communicative method. Then, of course, there are other challenges to the teaching of grammar. Krashen is one of the most famous, right? And you can read there what he said. It says. And he's still pretty convinced of that position. Now, other SLA people, and I've cited two here on the screen, are not as willing to go as far as Krashen says. And there are others who are even farther away from Krashen, but I find Coleman and particularly Bill Van Patten to be sort of right in the middle. And I find them to be useful because, for example, Van Patten says that grammar instruction that helps with acquisition, with language acquisition, grammar instruction that helps with acquisition by manipulating input, that can be useful. Because good input, so to speak, facilitates acquisition. By provide input that is readily assimilated into learners' underlying grammar system. So the bottom line is that enough serious research exists saying that we should teach grammar. And by the way, it also seems possible from the research that I've read that students perhaps base their use of a second language in both acquisition and learning. So that brings me to my next point, but I'll pause right there and ask did I leave anybody in the dust there? Is there anybody, a term that I need to clarify or will on board?
It's the last sentence at the bottom that I have a question about. Base their use of the second language on acquisition and learning.
That's kind of clumsily worded, right?
Well, I just don't understand how they wouldn't.
Indeed.
But I mean, how is that? Could you explain the background of the question?
Yeah, so I can. So there are some, again, I'm not an SLA specialist at all, but from my understanding of the research, there are some SLA scholars who say, really what you need is acquisition. And that's the only thing that's going to work. And that's kind of an extreme-ish view. But that the only way people are going to be able to learn and use a language is through acquisition of that language. So,
and acquisition is, this is my own shortcoming, so I apologize if this is super basic, but how is learning different from acquisition?
Right, so exactly. So learning, I kind of think of it this way based on my understanding of the SLA research. So acquisition is when you encounter the language and you see features in the language that sort of accord with your underlying grammatical system that is apparently innate inside human brains.
So learning is
this concept of this universal grammar.
Exposed to authentic input, and then you sort of
process it.
Process the patterns and things.
And they become ingrained into your the system of universal grammar that's in your noggin.
Oh no.
That's acquisition or?
That's acquisition.
Well, that's acquisition.
It becomes
okay.
ingrained in automatically ingrained in what is called universal grammar, which is, as I understand it, a system, sort of this universal system of grammatical.
The Chomsky. Okay.
And then learning is a more conscious, mindful approach to language use.
So sort of like approaching an artificial or something outside of
learning can be like learning anything other subject that they're studying. The acquisition is this implicit, not purposeful. You can't force it. It happens by virtue of being exposed to it.
Okay, so you're sort of shuffling it into your. Okay.
You said that way better than I did.
I'm an SLA researcher.
Okay. That's
Thank
it.
you.
Implicit versus explicit, right? In a way. Implicit is like,
Yeah.
and then explicit is you have to think about it.
Okay.
Yeah. Mindful. Okay. Good. All right. So if that might be the case, that students base their use of L2 on acquisition and learning, then that brings me to my next point. We still need to do it better. All right, so we've known for a long time that the emphasis on grammar drill and decontextualized grammar study really isn't what we need. The theoretical and practical research on that matter is pretty clear. And anyone who has taught, tricky grammar in any foreign language has probably noticed, right, that students don't always perform well on grammar tests. And even among those who do, the transfer from the grammar test to their reading, writing, listening, and speaking isn't always there in the measure that we would hope for. And in this area, I found Burns to be particularly helpful. She has worked to reconfigure in the L2 context Halliday's work in L1. He maintains, among other things, that his primary thesis is that language is not a system of forms with meaning attached to those forms, so to speak, right? So not a system of forms with meaning attached to those forms, but a system of meanings where the forms are a means to realize the meanings. So he sort of inverts the way one might traditionally think about grammar. And man, I know in my own experience, I really need to do this better. I need to teach grammar better. This is a study that I did several years ago. I think it was 2014 to 2016. And I'll explain in a second. So what I did was for 2 years, I collected data from grammar tests and then compared it to students' writing tasks. And I noticed those 4 broad trends. In some instances, in their writing, the students got it right, so to speak. There was grammar that we had worked on and that had been tested, and that they had done fine on the test, and they used it correctly in the writing. Hooray. The other thing that made me happy was grammar that we had tested and studied, they then were comfortable using. Something that had been newly introduced that semester that they hadn't studied before. They decided, I'm okay using that. So those were both good things. But there was a lot of this. Errors, sure, that's to be expected, right? Didn't always, the performance on the test did not always predict success when doing a writing task. They might conjugate their irregular verbs properly on a test and then foul them up in the paper. We've all seen that. This was the thing that intrigued me the most right here, was that we had studied grammar structure X, Y, and Z. And then in a paper or some other writing task that clearly, to me, called out for the use of that particular grammar structure, students avoided it. Where it would have been the right tool to solve the community problem they were trying to solve. They avoided it. They didn't deploy it. And that's what that really question of why that is really fascinating me. Okay, so if we know we need to teach grammar better, the question is how. And this is, I've come to my final point, but I've spent the bulk of my attention here. So again, for me, the hard part of SOTL is deciding how to distill the research into teaching practice. I've explained already that we've borrowed from certain scholars to create curricular goals based on literacy. And I explained the curricular structure, that we have a curricular structure based on texts in a genre continuum. Okay. I didn't mention before, but I'll say now, that we also assigned topics or themes to each of our courses, so that my German 101, for instance, is about stereotypes of Germany and the Germans. So now that you kind of have a picture of our curriculum and our orientation, I'd like to show how, in my experimental way, I have tried to incorporate recent research on grammar instruction. Like I say, this will be the final part of my presentation. I'm just going to show examples, and I'll do as many as we have time and mental space for, and when we all go crazy, I'll stop. All right. Quickly setting method. I'll just let you read that. Yes, sir.
Can you gloss what low road transfer is?
Yeah, so that's not a term that Jessie Moore invented. It's something that she pulls out of the literature, but she wrote this really nice book called It's About Writing Transfer. I've been reading it in recent days, and she talks about how writing involves both low road and high road transfer from other areas. So low road transfer is sort of things that have become automated to the point that you don't even necessarily realize that you're doing them. And she talks about it in terms of generic moves that you make when you're writing. She's talking about L1 writing. But I think it also applies to the types of very nuts and bolts moves that students make. Say, for instance, if they're conjugating irregular verbs in their paper. They may not necessarily be super aware, I need to conjugate this irregular verb properly in my paper. They may just do it automatically because the quizzes have helped to automate it. Then there's high road transfer, which is where you think, I need to do X, Y, or Z in my writing task. Any questions about the quiz and homework?
Those quizzes in class or at home?
In class. To me, this is really important. Yes.
Could you give us the larger picture? Okay, these are quizzes. What else was happening for evaluation?
So for reading tasks, they have various assignments that have to do with like summarizing the text. Sometimes there's short answer questions like, what's this text about? For writing, they have a series of short essays and then a semester project. Listening, they typically watch short videos. This is third semester German, so short videos, and then similar, like what happened in this video, summarize. Speaking is in class, and it's maybe controversial, but that's also pass-fail, and everybody gets the same grade based on class discussion.
Scott, I do have just a quick question. You pointed out that the problems are the same type as the quiz. And that was the square, that third square, the bottom one on the left that intrigued me the most of the four that you put there. In part because you talked about the errors on the, getting answers correctly on the texts,
Right.
and then making errors in the writing. And I think we can all commiserate, but part of that also, I think, has to do, or at least in looking at the data that you're showing us, that it seems natural because it's not an authentic assessment in the sense that, right, okay.
Exactly.
So, all right.
Right.
We're getting to that.
I wouldn't have said it the way you did. And I think that's important.
Yeah.
The way I was testing at the time I did that previous study, which is this study I'm doing now, comes out of that one. I was testing in a more traditional way.
So,
And now I'm working on testing in a way that looks more like writing tasks.
yeah, and I don't know if you're gonna share, I would be curious to see the prompts.
That's what I'm going to do.
Okay,
Yeah,
there we go.
exactly.
All right.
No, that's exactly it. Is I want the test to look like a writing task,
Okay.
sort of a short writing task, and therefore the homework, and therefore how we approach grammar in the first place. Yeah.
That makes sense.
So here's how I begin. I don't know if you can see that in the back. Is that big enough? Then I won't open the big form. So students click on that, and there is a very quick explanation of fundamentals of past tense usage. It's 4 slides. Here's why. So this article that came out in 2009, there was some evidence that if you structure the way students are going to approach their grammar acquisition before they really get into looking at the input, that you can influence how they will process that input, and therefore they'll learn it better. So that's why I do this, is they just get a little taste of what an explanation of grammar before they confront the input.
Is the definition, for want of a better word, in German or in English?
It's in English. Yeah, because it's sort of, it's, well, we can talk about that later, but it's in English. Okay, and then after that, the next step is when they click on that link, they get a page that has a text. In this instance, it was the Oktoberfest, and I have highlighted usage of the past tense. That's all it is. Every past tense verb is highlighted in yellow, and there's 30 of them in this particular text. And then I ask that question, and here's why. Good? Shall I go on? What I like about these strategies is that they fit with the larger research on teaching and learning. Susan Ambrose wrote this wonderful book called How Learning Works. And that's one of the chapters, or one of the topics she addresses is metacognition. And then the third step, so the students have gotten a quick presentation on grammar, they've encountered a ton of input, and then now I ask them to start beginning to formulate their own use of the language. And here's just multiple choice, but it requires them, if you don't read German constructs the perfect tense with a helping verb and a participle. And the selection of helping verb matters. One helping verb is used in one situation and a different helping verb in a different situation, and so on. So they have to be attentive to which helping verb is called for in that particular instance. Does that make sense? Tell me if I'm leaving anybody behind. Yes, please.
But in your English, say that the Oktoberfest was founded in the 19th century. you're dealing with a passive in the
Correct.
past.
Right, I know.
I mean, isn't that a huge jump?
I haven't found that it is, because when I used to teach perfect without passive past, teach them separately, students would always say this when they meant this. So I decided a number of years ago that the past tense passive is constructed like the perfect. And so if it looks like a duck and quacks like a duck, my students think it is a duck, so I'm going to teach it together with the perfect. So I don't teach passive separately as, we identify it as such, we identify it as the passive, and they know what passive is, but I teach it together.
Do they know what passive is in English?
I do.
Good.
Their sixth grade teachers told them not to use it, so they know it for that. Okay.
Also have been introduced to it, right? This idea of like give them a short intro on what they will be doing so that they're understanding cognition
Oh,
of the
yeah.
structures. Yeah.
Of course.
Yeah. So-
Right, I'm glad you mentioned that,
Yeah.
because the text that I share with them, the text that they read at the very outset about the Oktoberfest, has multiple instances of past passive, along with, so it's got all three of these helping verb usages. So I need to address it in the instruction as well. Sharpened another pitchfork. That's fine, I know. Then, fourth step is to ask students to come up with a pattern or they like the word rule, I don't love it. And these, I mentioned all of these folks earlier, I'm just reminding you that's sort of justification for asking people that question. All right, and then here, finally, we get to move into production. And this is, I'll let you read them first. These types of problems appear both on homework and in quizzes. The first set of problems, those are mostly homework, but these could be homework or quiz.
Can you quickly say we should provide lexical field what would be in there?
Mm-hmm.
Like a list of words or?
Yes,
What I
exactly.
know.
So a list of words drawn from the text on the Oktoberfest, drawn from the text, that would allow students to accomplish that task.
Right.
So, for example, it would include Die Biergarten. The text that we read has the phrase Ort der Begegnung, so a place of meeting, instead of English. Multiple words and word clusters that they can then remix and deploy in order to achieve this communicative goal. By the way, that I give them the German. I knew not everybody in here was going to read German, so this right here on the test, it would actually, this sentence would be in German. Okay. Yes.
Two questions.
Mhm.
The first question is, from what I understand, and I don't speak much German, I did study a little bit, but the structure that you're presenting is something that has parallel, sort of a corresponding structure in English, right? I'm thinking about this because right now I'm teaching the past subjunctive in Spanish, which doesn't have an obvious equivalent
Right.
in English. So I'm wondering sort of how to translate that into something that doesn't, that it couldn't give an English equivalent for.
Corresponding.
I do teach a translation course, and by doing meaning, I think I could, but I'm just thinking about how, and we don't use any English in those courses, so this is really a new way of thinking about it. It seems like you would have to spend a lot of time teaching them what words like modal verb and lexical field, because I'm kind of rusty on those things myself, so it would take some review on my part, but even sort of taking the time to teach those things to sort of lay the groundwork for this approach is a different way of investing your time. So
It takes less investment in class than you might suspect. I do take early in the semester as they're getting used to these new approaches, I will take some time to talk about what is a lexical field and why is it useful? Where do they come from? Who generates them? Where do you get them from? You get them from the text. And we do one together. But then they're good. And then some of the other things like teaching what a modal verb is, that comes during this phase, that phase. Preview of the grammar. Those slides say, this is a modal verb. Here's what a modal verb does. Here's why you would want to use it.
And so when you're giving instruction and when you're testing, you're still using that language. But at a certain point, when they're in an authentic setting, they just have to use it without
Correct.
being prompted to. Do you find that there's any sort of transition that's rough there?
Yes, that is a rough transition.
Okay.
It absolutely is a rough transition. So when they are, let's see, I'll skip ahead. When they are prompted in a short paper, I'll tell them, use these things. But then when left to their own devices, that's the question is, do they use those things? If they're not told to use those grammar structures, do they? Sometimes yes, sometimes no.
Can I add a comment also? So for example, with something like the lexical field, in German we can use like Wortfeld, and so if you tell them, okay, we have an authentic text and you can create this cluster of words and phrases that relate to the topic, once they've done that, you only need to say the one word, Wortfeld, and they know kind of what you want them to do, and you sort of help them create building blocks that then for this writing task they can draw on. If they have talked about the cultural relevance of the Oktoberfest and they have created lists of word clusters and phrases, and they also get a sense of what kind of grammatical structures can help them, like connectors. Then once they get to writing tasks, they have all of these building blocks. They know I have a list of phrases of words that are already kind of structured around different meaning creation processes, and then they can draw on that to create a composition that puts these building blocks together. And it doesn't really matter if they understand all the technical terms, but they know what elements they have to draw on by just, if you say lexical field, they know exactly what you're referring to because you've done it multiple times. So it's establishing a common vocabulary, I think.
And it really goes pretty smoothly after you teach them that once, and then they're good to go. Here you can see me asking them to think metacognitively about the writing task. And then here I'm giving them specific. We've just studied this grammar in the last few weeks. Use it for this purpose.
And so people criticize this approach and say, like, well, you're dictating exactly what they're using. That's very artificial writing. On the other hand, one could say, well, if you don't ever tell them what to use, they might never use those structures, right? So is that the kind of the
That
tension?
was what happened. I did focus groups last year on that great question, and that's what they said, is that they actually requested that I require certain grammar so that they could get used to using it.
And Scott, you don't feel you could get the same results by phrasing the prompt in a way that require certain grammar. So I'm thinking of a prompt like, what did you do yesterday, and what would you have done yesterday if you didn't do what you did? right, which is,
I think we need both. I think we
Okay.
need the prompt that's a bad example of, I think that's not actually an ideal prompt for doing what you're saying. An ideal prompt would be something like, is the Oktoberfest what you thought it was? And then it would force them to talk about the founding of the origins of the Oktoberfest. And for that, they need past tense. And then you can also say, down here, use past tense verbs. Check your helping verbs. So yes, I think that the prompt, absolutely, you're completely correct. The prompt needs to require certain structure.
I get it, I think this is really cool, but I'm trying to think of how to have it complement things that we already do, so.
Right. You are quite right. I think that this is the type of thing I always did ask, and now I'm saying, okay, do that. And then, of course, the problem is, what if they are not prompted to do so? Do they remember to do so? Sometimes they do, and sometimes they don't. Yes.
And what is the purpose of documenting dictionary use?
I want to, that's sort of, I guess it's not totally related to the project that I'm talking about today. It's just something I noticed in my teaching that I don't mind if they use the dictionary because the lexical field that we co-create as a class doesn't always contain the elements that they need when they go to perform the writing task. So they're allowed to use the dictionary. I just want to know where.
And this is a much worse question. Do you address at all the use of Google Translate?
Yes, I do. In multiple ways. I show them how many errors it makes. I tell them, but do not show them, that it cues me in that they've used it. Because, for instance, Google Translate will get things right that they don't know how to do yet. Such as in adjective declension. Google Translate does a really nice job of adjective declension, and nobody in third semester German at my institution can do that.
Can I make one more comment? Ellen, so you said, can we also get to this without spelling out? I think if you provide them with sort of a list of things you want them to use and already sort of this lexical feel of words, it actually, I think, decreases the risk of them going to Google Translate because they feel like they already have a certain kind of sense of what structures and words and phrases they can use to successfully perform the task. Because both the structures and the lexical field are chosen in a way that it sets them up for success with this communicative cultural task. And I think by giving them that, you might actually minimize the temptation to turn to Google Docs to some degree, because they might say, well, I know this structure is helpful, I know all of these words and phrases are helpful, so I better rely on that because this is what was given to me and created together rather than turning to Google Translate. I'm not sure if that's true, but
yes,
I would
it's true.
think so. If,
Yes.
they have sort of a source of these are the structures that can help you to successfully do this, why should I turn
Absolutely.
to Google Translate?
Why should I turn to Google Translate? And when they do, then I have a talk with them about it and point out that it's not helping them. I actually don't, first time they do it, I don't really penalize it. I just say it's not helping you. And I can tell you're doing it. And I tell them it's okay to show me your errors and your struggles because that's why you're in this class. You're here to learn and I'm here to help you. I need to see where your problems are. So I make it okay for them to fail on their writing tasks. And then when they do, I say, okay, well, let's make this less bad. Let's improve this. That's really, I have just one more. I've talked about the focus groups not very long, but there you have it. And then the final piece I have for you is that it's beginning to work. I launched this project in earnest last fall and started to see the fruits of it in the spring and even more so this fall. And here's what I have noticed.
bottom is something that still needs to be improved. Is that an issue
Yeah.
still, the bottom thing persistent, or?
Definitely, these definitely still need to be improved. This one, I think, we can get rid of easily if we stop teaching rules and adapt a more SLA approach to grammar acquisition. The big picture of the evidence that I've seen is that the writing tasks that my students are engaging in are noticeably better than they were 2 years ago. That's sort of the big picture, and those are the details. So, that is that, and that is incorrect. It's just, yeah. If you want my slides, I think that URL is correct. If you want any of my instructional materials, you can have anything you like, just email me and I'll send you my Google Docs, texts, everything.
Oh. I think we have some time for questions, and I don't think we need a moderator. If there are more questions, you can just call people. Scott.
I have a question. The SOTL is based on research. So, and you presented the evidence at the end. So I wonder how you're going to collect the data to go from what you presented to the evidence.
Yeah, so the data collection from student writing tasks is, I recently saw an article on how we often do that incorrectly.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I know that what I've done in the past is sort of close reading of the student writing tasks, where I document errors, document correct use, document when students take advantage of a structure, when they fail to take advantage of the structure. The article that I read recently said we need to look more holistically at student writing to evaluate how often and how well they are using the grammatical moves that we teach them. Sort of less nitty-gritty and more big picture. So that's, I mean, I guess maybe mixed methods might be the way to go.
Okay.
Did anybody check whether that link is correct? It works. Okay.
I guess one question I would have is, in sort of leading up to the writing of that final writing project for a certain unit, are there writing tasks in between where they already move to that production stage? So the grammar instruction you showed that you primarily do online with, like, form, say which is the correct sentence here, but is there also shorter writing, I guess, where they already have writing tasks that are not like a whole paper, but shorter?
There are, yes.
Guided tasks?
That's
Okay.
right.
Yeah, okay.
Your question, though, makes me think I could do a better mix of those. I tend to ask for, sort of 3/4 of a page early in the semester.
Right.
And it seems like, and to do that, they have one of those every 10 days or so. So there are multiple short writing, medium-sized writing tasks over the semester. But it seems as though, that's a good thought. You could have tasks that are 75 words in length, rather than the stuff on a quiz is 30 words in length, and the paper is 250 words. Something in between might be nice. That's a good thought.
The link works.
Okay, good. So, skepticism, pitchforks, run me out of town on a rail, disbelief, what?
Can I have a small pitchfork?
Yeah.
So it's more of a question. So there seems to be a lot of metacognition about grammar, sort of giving them the tools to reflect on the use of grammar. Is there ever a situation in your classroom where you just discuss a cultural topic, let's say orally, they talk about something, without at all reflecting on the grammar? Would you say whenever there is any written or spoken conversation or form of language production, there is always also reflection, meaning before you have them talk to a small group of students, will you say, okay, let's all remind ourselves this is how past tense works, don't forget the helping verb, or do you say, okay, was haben Leute auf dem Oktoberfest gemacht? You just ask a question that triggers that, or is there always metacognitive reflection of grammar? No, okay.
There's not
That's
always.
good. Okay, yeah.
It's not always there.
Good.
It tends to be more there with the writing,
Yeah.
and less with spoken German. Because just based on the work with Burns and her circle, I tend to see writing as a capacity builder,
Sure.
a space within which students can build their overall language capacities. And then when they go to speak, quite frankly, I privilege spoken fluency over perfect accuracy.
That makes sense. Absolutely.
I know that there's research on type of feedback that can be given during oral tasks, but I'm not well versed in it. It's on my reading list.
In a typical class, do you dedicate one class a week to this approach, or is this a 5-10 minute segment in every class? If you answered that already, I apologize.
No, I didn't think I did. So, if I understand your question, so stop me if I'm not answering what you asked. So this kind of stuff, that's a Google form. That happens every day as homework. And then, and it's early in a new unit. It's that sort of, hey, pick this or pick that, and then later in the unit it's more this. But there's that sort of out of class task for every class period. Is that what you were asking?
Yeah, I was trying to figure out, is this once a week out of 3 or 4 times a week, or is it in every class? Yeah, that was
Right.
my...
No, I don't do all of that in every class. It's this, what I just showed you took place over the course of 2 weeks with different things every day, different types of tasks with different goals. Emphases on writing some days, emphases on speaking other days.
Looking at this, when you do this with them, do you give them examples? I use a modal verb in beide to talk about the social function of Vielgelten. Do you give them your own personal example?
I don't.
Okay.
I don't, because at this point we're nearing the end of that grammar unit. And we've
okay.
talked a lot about what
Okay.
the verbs are.
All right, well, that helps to know.
Mhm.
So you would say a cornerstone of this approach is also really this idea that authentic texts can function as a very efficient input for grammatical structures,
Absolutely.
both also for words, for lexical fields, but also for grammatical structures. And I mean, I found that in my teaching, whenever we talk about grammar, either in their own writing or in authentic text, that makes a lot more sense. My example is always in German passive voice. Students can form the passive voice without problems, and they still tell me, why should I use it? Every passive voice sentence could be an active voice sentence. In what kind of context would Germans use passive voice? And if you have an authentic text where they see in what kind of communicative scenario it's used, it makes a lot more sense than if I give them just the rule, this is how you form passive voice, because then they know how to form it, but they don't know in what context to draw on that, right? And by
Right.
using authentic texts also, I believe that helps with that, I would assume.
Absolutely. They saw the text about the Oktoberfest. There were a dozen examples of passive.
Yeah, yeah. Well, if there are no other questions, another round of applause for Scott. Thanks to you all for coming out, and have a good night on this rainy evening.